Linda. She had been sitting on my sofa that night, her purse perched on her arm, watching my marriage crumble with the calm expression of someone watching a carefully laid plan unfold. I had always felt there was something off about her relationship with Derek. Not a mother's love, which was genuine in its own twisted way, but an influence that felt like invisible puppet strings. Derek rarely made a major move without consulting his mother first. Even after I married, she remained a constant presence that I'd learned to accept as a family quirk, never questioning it deeply. Now I wondered how many of those decisions had actually been hers. How many of the shifts I'd noticed in my husband's behavior over the last few months were actually reflections of instructions received over the phone while I was at the office. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. It was a typical Atlanta night. Cars streaming by, a family walking their dog, the neon glow of a convenience store on the corner. The world was completely indifferent to the storm inside me. I thought about Thomas Elliott Caldwell. We'd married when I was 26 and he was 31, at a time when I was convinced I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. We were together for 4 years. It wasn't a story of grand tragedies. It was the story of two people who genuinely loved each other and then discovered, slowly and without drama, that they wanted different lives. He wanted to climb the corporate ladder, build a massive net worth, and live in the fast lane. I wanted meaningful projects, small-town charm, and room to breathe. We divorced without bitterness, split what we had honestly, and moved on. I had no idea he'd become that wealthy. I didn't know because I'd never asked and never cared beyond natural curiosity. Thomas was brilliant and hardworking, and I always knew he'd be successful at whatever he did. But $77 million was a reality, so far removed from the life I knew that it simply never entered my imagination. And now there were people who knew it before I did. People who had spent months researching, planning, and betraying, while I worked, slept, cooked, and loved, all to position themselves around money I didn't even know existed. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the hot, chaotic anger of the night he kicked me out. It was a cold, organized fury that settled in the bottom of my chest, like something heavy and permanent. I went back to bed. I grabbed my phone and texted Catherine. I want everything. Every piece of evidence. Every detail. I won't accept a settlement, I won't accept a deal, and I won't accept hush money. I want the whole truth to come out. She replied minutes later with just 4 words. That is the plan. It was the following week that I received the call I didn't expect. It wasn't from Catherine. It wasn't from Ruth. It was a number I recognized immediately as Derek's. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, I picked up. Megan. His voice sounded different than I expected. The calculated coldness from the night he threw me out was gone. There was something closer to tension. We need to talk. I'm listening. A pause. Not over the phone. In person. I'm not meeting you without my lawyer present. Another silence. You hired a lawyer. Yes. He took a deep breath. I could hear it. Megan, I think things got out of hand. I made mistakes. I want to talk about it. I weighed those words carefully, like someone examining a suspicious package. Mistakes. Not what I did was wrong. Not, I'm sorry. Mistakes. The passive word used by people who want to look repentant without admitting intent. Derek, I said, with a calmness that surprised even me. If you want to talk, call Catherine Reeves. You can find her office number easily. Good night. I hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand until the screen went dark. And then, very slowly, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized the board had been flipped, and this time, she was the one with the advantage. My daughter moved for the first time that night. I know that at 16 weeks, I should have felt it sooner. But I think I had been so shut down, so wrapped in layers of shock, anger, and survival, that I hadn't been paying enough attention to my own body. But that night, right after hanging up on Derek, I felt it. A soft, unmistakable flutter, like a bubble forming and popping right in the center of my belly. I placed my hand there immediately. "Hi," I whispered. She didn't move again, but she didn't have to. I already knew I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The routine prenatal checkup was scheduled for an October morning at a clinic about 12 blocks from Ruth's apartment. I'd gone to the first few appointments alone, not exactly by choice, but because asking Ruth to tag along for everything felt like admitting I'd become completely dependent on someone else's charity. And there was a small, stubborn pride inside me that resisted that more than it should. But Ruth went anyway. She showed up at my bedroom door at 7:30 in the morning, car keys in hand and a look that left no room for debate. "Don't say a word," she warned. "Just grab your bag." I grabbed my bag. The waiting room was one of those places you don't easily forget. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. Rows of beige plastic chairs, a TV in the corner playing a morning talk show on mute, a table with old magazines no one touched. And women. Women in every stage of pregnancy, some with husbands, some with mothers, some alone staring at their phones with that expression of trying to look busy so they wouldn't have to think too much. I sat next to Ruth and looked at my hands in my lap. "Nervous?" she asked softly. "Always." A pause. But not in a bad way. It was true. A new kind of nervous had entered my life since I felt that first movement 2 weeks ago. Not the nerves of fear, but the nerves of someone carrying something precious and afraid of tripping. Every appointment was a confirmation that this was real. That she was real. That regardless of everything crumbling around me, there was something growing inside me that was entirely mine. The doctor called my name 20 minutes later. Ruth stayed in the waiting room, respecting my space. I went in alone. The ultrasound lasted maybe 10 minutes. The doctor moved the transducer slowly over my belly, which was covered in cold gel, and on the screen appeared that grainy black and white image that people who've never seen it think is impossible to decipher, but to a mother is as clear as day. There she was, lying on her side, tiny hands near her face. The outlines were still soft, still forming, but unmistakably there. Unmistakably alive. "Everything looks exactly as it should," the doctor said in that professional, calm tone that simultaneously relieved me and made me want to cry with gratitude. "Strong heartbeat. Growth is right on track for gestational age." "Is it a girl?" I asked. It was still early to be certain, but I'd asked them to check if possible. The doctor tilted the monitor slightly. She squinted. "She's in a bit of a curled position, but from what I can see, yes, likely a girl." I stared at the screen a second longer than necessary. Ellie, I thought, without knowing where the name came from. It just arrived, the way some right things do. Unannounced, effortless, simply present. Ellie. It was on the way out of the clinic that the encounter I hadn't planned for happened. I was walking out the side door, Ruth beside me already opening her Maps app to decide where we'd grab lunch, when I tripped on the bottom step of the entrance. A ridiculous, poorly marked step designed to catch the distracted. My ankle gave way slightly, and I instinctively lurched forward, trying to catch my balance. A hand caught me by the arm before I hit the pavement. Firm, fast, no hesitation. "Careful there." I looked up. The man who had caught me was in his early 40s, dark hair graying at the temples, wearing a work jacket with the logo of a veterinary clinic embroidered on the pocket. He had the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Skin slightly weathered by the sun, hands that were clearly working hands, but eyes that were observant and calm. "Thank you," I said, straightening up quickly and feeling the inevitable flush of someone who almost fell in public. "That step gets a lot of people," he said, without a hint of condescension, just stating a fact. "I've seen at least 3 people trip there this morning alone." "Just this morning?" Ruth had already switched into the social mode she naturally used with strangers. "Imagine on rainy days." He smiled slightly. "On rainy days, it's an act of mercy to have someone standing out here." There was something about him that was hard to name immediately. It wasn't charm in a performative sense. It wasn't that calculated friendliness some people use as a social tool. It was simply presence. The kind of person who is completely where they are, without being mentally somewhere else at the same time. "James Callahan," he said, extending a hand. Not to me first, but to Ruth, which for some reason I noted as a detail. "Ruth Calloway," she said, shaking it. "And this is Megan." He looked at me. I shook the hand he offered. "Here for an appointment?" he asked, direct but not invasive. "Prenatal," I said, not quite knowing why I was sharing that with a stranger. He nodded, making no additional comment on the subject, which I also noted. People usually make comments. "Congratulations. What a beautiful stage. Is the dad here too?" Sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes intrusive. He did none of that. "Do you work there?" Ruth pointed to the embroidery on his jacket. "Right next door. Callahan Veterinary Clinic." He gestured vaguely to the adjacent building. "My partner is on vacation, so I'm covering her shift too this week." "Double duty?" Ruth said. "It is what it is," he said without complaint, just as a matter of fact. We stood there for maybe 2 more minutes of light conversation about the dangerous step in the neighborhood, and then he said a natural goodbye and headed back into the clinic building. Ruth and I walked to the car. "He was handsome," she said once the doors were closed. "Ruth, I'm just making an objective observation. I'm 16 weeks pregnant, I have a massive lawsuit pending, and about $100 or so. I know all that. I just said he was handsome." I made a point of looking out the window so she wouldn't see me trying not to smile. Catherine called that same afternoon. I had learned to recognize the different tones of her calls. There was the informative tone, the cautious tone, and the sit-down tone. This call was the third. "We gained access to email records through a court order," she said, getting straight to the point as always. "The burner account I mentioned before. Megan, what we found is significant." I sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell me." The account was created with a recovery address linked to a phone number. That number is registered to Linda Harper. I closed my eyes for a second. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, "the email sent from that account to Thomas. Caldwell's relatives contain specific information about you that only someone with access to your personal files could have. Dates, address history, maiden name, the date of your divorce from Thomas, information that isn't publicly available." She went through my private documents. Or Derek obtained them and passed them to her. We're looking into both possibilities, but the practical result is the same. There was a deliberate, coordinated investigation into you and Thomas Caldwell's estate, conducted by at least 2 people. What did the email say? A brief pause. She identified herself as a researcher working on an audit of Oregon state property records and asked Thomas's family if they'd been contacted regarding beneficiaries. She was trying to fish for the amounts involved and whether there were any active challenges to the will. I sat in silence, processing it. "There's more," Catherine said. One of the relatives replied. Thomas's sister, a woman named Patricia Caldwell. She didn't give financial details, but she mentioned there was a beneficiary outside the family and that the estate lawyer was already in contact with that person. After that reply, the email account was abandoned. No further messages sent. 2 days later, Derek made his first searches regarding international wire transfers. The timeline formed in my head with a clarity that stung. Linda had mapped the terrain. When she realized I was about to be contacted by the lawyer, she tipped off Derek. Derek accelerated the plan, kicking me out before I officially got the news, draining the accounts, probably thinking that without resources and in a state of shock, I'd be easier to manipulate or pressure into a settlement that benefited them. What they hadn't counted on was that I wouldn't collapse. "Catherine," I said, "given all this, what's our legal standing?" "Strong." She said the word with a confidence I recognized as the opposite of bluster. The bank transfers made during the marriage, especially in the context we're documenting, constitute clear bad faith. You are entitled to a full return of those assets. As for the inheritance, it's protected and was never at legal risk from them. But their efforts to interfere in the process are something Thomas's lawyer will want to document as well. I'm in touch with Gerald Moss. And Linda? Her conduct could have civil and possibly criminal implications depending on the full picture. But that's a separate, slower process. I took a deep breath. What do I do now? For now, document everything. Any contact from Derek or Linda by any means. Don't respond to anything directly without consulting me first. And she paused, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone. Take care of yourself, of the baby. This process is going to take months, and I need you to be whole when we get to the finish line. After I hung up, I went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror for a while. I looked different. It wasn't the bump. That was still at the stage where only I and Ruth could really tell. It was something else. There was a look in my eyes that hadn't been there before. Not hardness. Exactly. More like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the fog of shock finally lifts and you start to see the actual outlines of what's standing in front of you. The settlement offer arrived in writing, through Derek's attorney, 10 days later. Catherine called me the second she received it. I was at the office. I'd gone back to working in person the week before because I needed the routine, and because I'd discovered that working kept me sane in a way that the guest room, as cozy as it was, couldn't. I stepped out into the hallway to take the call. His lawyer sent over a proposal, Catherine said. They want to settle out of court. They're offering to return 60% of the funds transferred from the accounts in exchange for you signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and waiving any future legal action related to his conduct during the marriage. 60%. And silence. Bought and paid for by contract. No, I said. Megan, before you decide. No, Catherine. My voice was calm. It's not about the money. 60, 100, it doesn't matter. They want me to stay quiet. They want to keep this from coming out. They want Linda Harper to stay the respectable pillar of the community who shows up at charity events, and they don't want anyone to know what she did. I'm not signing that. A beat of silence. And then Catherine said something I didn't expect. I knew. You'd say that. I just needed to be sure. It was a Friday night, 3 weeks later, when I ran into James Callahan again. Ruth had insisted on a night out. You need air that isn't from a guest room or a cubicle. And we'd gone to a small hole-in-the-wall place a few blocks from the clinic. The kind of neighborhood spot with dark wood tables, low amber lighting, and a menu scrawled on a chalkboard. He was sitting alone at a table near the window with a half-finished plate and an open book beside him, which felt like a revealing detail, the mark of someone comfortable enough in their own skin that they didn't need a screen to distract them. He looked up as we walked past. He recognized me in that split second where someone's brain registers a familiar face before deciding what to do with it. The woman from the steps, he said, with a small smile. The vet. Ruth chimed in before I could say a word. He invited us to sit with a naturalness that wasn't pushy. It was more like someone offering a seat and leaving the option to refuse genuinely open. Ruth accepted before I could even open my mouth. The three of us had dinner. The conversation was the kind that happens when the people around the table are honest without being heavy. We talked about the neighborhood, the restaurant, his veterinary practice. I learned that James had moved to Atlanta 2 years ago from a small town in Tennessee after a marriage that had ended without fireworks or drama, just the realization that we'd grown into different people, as he put it, with a lack of self-pity that surprised me. I didn't tell him anything about my situation, not because I was hiding it, but because there's a difference between being honest and being the kind of person who dumps their entire life into a stranger's lap during a first real conversation. But when we said goodbye on the sidewalk, he looked at me for a second. Not with the calculated curiosity of someone trying to gauge romantic interest, but with something simpler. Genuine attention. "I hope things are going well," he said. That was it. And there was something in those 6 simple words, no prying, no questions I hadn't answered, that sounded kinder than anything anyone had said to me in weeks. In the car on the way back, Ruth stayed silent for 2 whole minutes, which for Ruth was an eternity. "Don't say a word," I warned. "I didn't say anything," she replied, looking visibly pleased with herself. But that night, lying in the guest room with my hand on my stomach and Ellie quiet inside me, I kept thinking about those steady, calm eyes and that simple sentence. "I hope things are going well." It had been so long since anyone had said that to me without wanting something in return. November arrived in Atlanta with that damp chill that isn't quite cold enough for winter, but has lost all the lightness of fall. The trees outside Ruth's apartment had dropped half their leaves, and the ones that remained were that shade of rust and honey that doesn't last long, which somehow makes it more beautiful. I had started paying attention to these small things. The color of the leaves, the smell of coffee in the morning, the texture of the sweater that had become my favorite over the last few weeks. I think it was a way my body found to stay anchored in the present while my head was split between the past that was being dismantled and a future that hadn't taken shape yet. 20 weeks. Halfway there. The doctor had confirmed it at the last appointment. A girl, for sure now. Ellie. The name that had arrived without warning remained the only one that made sense, and I'd stopped questioning where it came from. Some certainties don't need an explanation. Ruth had imperceptibly transformed the guest room over the weeks. First, a softer bedside lamp appeared, then a small rug by the bed. One afternoon, I found a small plant on the dresser with a note. "Plants help you breathe, literally and otherwise." We never discussed it directly, because Ruth and I had communicated like this for 20 years, through small gestures that said what words would make too heavy. It was a Tuesday in November, with a light drizzle on the window and tea cooling. On my desk, when Catherine texted me asking me to come to the office. Not a phone call this time. In person. I knew it was important. She was waiting for me with 2 of her associates in the conference room. A long table stacked with organized piles of documents, each one marked with color-coded tabs. There was a different kind of gravity in the air. The kind that settles in when the people in a room already know what's about to be said and are just waiting for the right moment to say it. "Thank you for coming," Catherine said, closing the door. "We have a full picture now, or close enough to it." I sat down and folded my hands on the table. "Tell me everything." She opened the first stack of documents. Derek's phone records had been subpoenaed and obtained the previous week. Catherine had analyzed them alongside a forensic accountant who specialized in divorce fraud. What the records showed was a constant, systematic line of communication between Derek and Linda Harper in the 11 months leading up to my being kicked out, which in itself wouldn't be unusual for a mother and son, except for the pattern. The longest calls, the ones lasting between 20 and 50 minutes, always happened on weekday mornings between 8 and 10 a.m. when Derek knew I was at the office. And after every long call, there was a concrete action, A search performed on the home computer, a small transfer testing the limits, an email sent from the burner account. "He was taking instructions from her," said the younger associate, a man in his 30s with thin-rimmed glasses who had been introduced as Raphael. "The pattern is clear. She did the research, figured things out, called him, and he executed. She was the strategist. He was the boots on the ground." I stared at the printouts in front of me. Columns of numbers, times, durations. The anatomy of a betrayal, reduced to data points. "And the money?" I asked. Catherine opened the second stack. "The transfers he made the night you left went into 2 different accounts. One in his name, a personal account he'd opened 6 months prior without telling you. The other..." She made a calculated pause. "Into a joint account held by Derek and Linda Harper." I looked up. "A joint account between mother and son," Raphael confirmed. "Opened 8 months ago. The amount sent to that account that night was $3,200, but it already had prior activity that we're currently tracing." "She was getting paid for it," I said, my voice low. "We can't say that for certain yet," Catherine said with her usual caution. "But it's a possibility the data supports. What we can state for certain is that Linda had direct financial access to assets that should have been part of the marital estate." I sat in silence for a long moment. There was something about this that was different from everything I'd discovered so far. It wasn't a surprise. I already knew Linda was involved. It was something else. It was the specific weight of realizing that the woman who had called me daughter in the early weeks of the marriage, who had given me a silver necklace for our first Christmas, who had sat next to me at the Thanksgiving table for 6 years. That woman had spent nearly a year using me like an object, in a financial play. She had faked every smile, every hug, every "I'm so glad my son has you," while working to hollow me out. "There's more," Catherine said. I looked at her. She opened the third stack. These documents looked different from the spreadsheets and phone logs. They were printed emails, but not from the burner account of Linda's that had been mentioned before. These had different headers. "Gerald Moss sent us copies of correspondence from Thomas's estate," Catherine said. "Correspondence that his team had filed away, but hadn't immediately connected to your case. When we reached out and explained the framework we were building, he reviewed the files and found this." She pushed the papers toward me. They were emails sent to Gerald Moss's office by someone identifying themselves as a legal representative for Megan Harper, inquiring about deadlines for accepting the inheritance and the legal consequences of a potential renunciation by the beneficiary. I looked at the date on the emails. 3 weeks before I was kicked out. 3 weeks before I even knew there was an inheritance. "Someone tried to find out if they could force me to renounce it," I said, my voice sounding strangely flat, because sometimes when something is too big, the body chooses calm as its only survival mechanism. Moss's office didn't reply to the emails, because there was no legal representative of record with that profile, Catherine said. But the attempt was made, and the originating IP address for these emails, she paused, is the same as Linda's burner account. The silence that settled in the conference room had a different quality than the silences before. It was the silence of a picture finally being complete, of the last pieces clicking into place, and the image that appeared was clearer and uglier than any version I had imagined. "They wanted to see if they could force me to walk away," I said, "or if I would renounce it without realizing what I was doing, if I were broken enough." "That is the most logical interpretation of the documents," Catherine confirmed. I thought about the night I was kicked out, the rain, the suitcases on the porch, the $117 in the bank. I thought about how I had slept in that car, pregnant, in shock, with nowhere to go. They had calculated that it would be enough to break me. It almost was. "What do we do with all this?" I asked. We compile a full dossier and file the petition this week, Catherine said. The preliminary hearing should be set for mid-December. She looked me directly in the eye. Megan, I want you to know that what we have here is solid. It's not perfect, no case is, but it's solid enough that a judge will see exactly what happened. Nodding was all I could manage at that moment. It was 3 days after that meeting, on a Saturday morning, that Linda Harper appeared. I had gone out for a walk alone. Ruth was in a work meeting, and I'd promised myself 30 minutes of fresh air a day, doctor's orders, circulation, and everything else that came with being 21 weeks pregnant. I was walking through the park 2 blocks from the apartment, hands in my coat pockets, headphones around my neck but no music playing, just wanting the silence of the outdoors. She was sitting on a bench near the fountain. I saw her before she saw me, and for a split second, I thought about turning around and leaving. But something, I don't know if it was courage, curiosity, or a controlled anger looking for an exit, made me keep walking until she looked up and saw me. Linda Harper, at 63, was still a woman who knew how to present herself. Gray wool coat, scarf, perfectly styled hair. But there was something different about her today, an absence of her usual perfect composure. Her eyes were slightly sunken, her posture less upright than usual. "Megan," she said. I stopped about 3 paces away. I didn't sit down. "Linda, I needed to see you." She didn't apologize for the approach, didn't explain how she'd found me. Derek likely still knew my routine well enough to guess where I might be. I needed to talk. My lawyer asked me not to have direct contact with... I know. She raised a hand slightly. I didn't come to talk about the case. I came to talk as a person. I stared at her. There was something genuine in that sentence that made it harder to just turn and walk away than it would have been if she had arrived with her usual armor. "What do you mean, Linda?" I asked. Direct, not cruel, but with no soft edges. She was silent for a moment. She looked at the fountain in front of us. "Derek is my son," she said finally. "When you're a mother, you'll one day understand that that changes the logic of everything you do. You make decisions you wouldn't make otherwise. You protect in ways that aren't always right. Protecting Derek didn't have to involve destroying me, Linda." "No." She admitted it with a firmness that surprised me. "It didn't." The wind stirred the dry leaves on the sidewalk near the bench. Someone was walking a dog in the distance, far enough away that we were just 2 women standing near a fountain. "I knew about the inheritance before Derek did," she said, in a way that didn't sound like a calculated confession. It sounded like a burden too heavy to carry. "I found a mention of Thomas Caldwell's probate in an Oregon business journal months ago. His name was familiar because I knew you'd been married to him. I did some digging. I found enough to understand there was a substantial estate involved. And then you told Derek. And then I started researching more." She paused. "I didn't think about doing anything concrete at first. I swear I didn't. But the more I saw, the more I understood the scale of what was at stake. My son is living with debts I know about and he's never told you. A business that went south, loans, constant pressure. When I saw that figure..." "You saw a solution to his problems," I said. "I saw a way out," she corrected, with a precision that was, in a way, more honest than if she had simply agreed. A way out that seemed available. Using money that belonged to me. She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Without a lawyer present, without anything? Why?" Linda remained silent for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Not in volume, but in texture. Something had surfaced from beneath her composure. "Because what's inside you," she glanced briefly at my stomach, "is my grandchild. And I've done things that might mean I'll never know that child." A pause. "I wanted you to know that this weighs on me. that not everything was calculated in cold blood, that I lost my way, the way people sometimes do when they love someone the wrong way. I stared at her for a long time. I didn't feel pity. But I didn't feel the hatred I expected to feel either. That clean, simple hate that would have been easier to carry. What I felt was something more complicated. The recognition that the people capable of doing us the most harm are often real people, with real affections, who made real decisions they can't undo. It didn't make what she had done any smaller. It didn't make the emails sent under a fake name any less real, or the transfers any less real, or that rainy night any less real. But it made her human in a way my hatred had been trying to deny. "Linda," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "what you told me today will need to be shared with my attorney. You understand that?" She closed her eyes for a second. "I understand. And the process will move forward. What you did has consequences that don't disappear just because you regret them." "I know. But," I paused, because the next word cost me something. "This child isn't to blame for any of this, and I'm not going to make decisions about her future based on your past. When the time comes, when all of this is settled and I know where I stand, the question of who she knows and who she doesn't will be decided by me, calmly. Not now. Not like this." Linda opened her eyes. There was something in them I hadn't seen before. She didn't say anything else. She stood up slowly, straightened her coat, and picked up her purse. "Thank you," she said simply. She turned and walked away along the park's gravel path. I stood there for a few minutes after she disappeared around the corner. The wind had grown colder. I tucked my hands into my coat pockets and felt Ellie move, a soft, clear nudge that lasted less than a second, but came at the exact moment I needed a reminder of why all of this mattered. I called Catherine as soon as I got back to the apartment. I told her everything, word for word, with the precision I'd learned over the months. Catherine listened in silence, and then asked if I'd recorded it. I hadn't. "It's not ideal," she said, "but the information has procedural value regardless." She voluntarily confirmed central aspects of the case. A pause. "How are you doing?" I thought before answering. "Strangely whole," I said. And it was true. There was something about that conversation in the park that had organized something inside me that had been cluttered for weeks. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But understanding. The difference between a storybook villain and a real person who had made bad choices for reasons I could, without approving, at least recognize as human. It was enough to keep going. 3 days later, James Callahan sent me a text. I had left my number with Ruth at the restaurant that night without realizing it, and Ruth had passed it on to him with that characteristic lack of subtlety I'd learned to love and fear in equal measure over 20 years of friendship. The message was short. "I saw there's an urban photography exhibit at the High Museum this weekend. Would you be up for checking it out with a vet who's reading the same book for the 3rd time because he has nothing else to do on a Saturday?" I stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't an invitation heavy with expectation. It was the invitation of someone who had calibrated the tone, carefully, light enough to be turned down without embarrassment, honest enough not to be interpreted as anything other than what it was. I thought about Ellie. I thought about the lawsuit. I thought about the December hearings. I thought about Ruth saying, "He was handsome," with that quiet satisfaction of someone who already knew what she was doing. And I thought about how I'd spent entire months making decisions based on fear, defense, and survival. There was something small and simple about going to see photography at a museum on a Saturday in November that wasn't risky, strategic, or complicated. Sometimes a person just needs something to be exactly that. Simple. I replied, "Sure. But fair warning, I ask a lot of questions about photography, and I don't know the first thing about it. He replied in less than 2 minutes. Perfect. Neither do I. That way neither of us has to pretend. I smiled at my phone. Ruth appeared in the bedroom doorway at that exact moment, as if she'd been waiting right outside. Don't say a word, I warned. I'm not saying a thing, she replied, visibly radiating satisfaction. But that night, before going to sleep, I took out the legal pad I'd bought weeks ago to jot down thoughts about the case, dates, names, details that might be useful. And I wrote something different. Not about the lawsuit, about Thomas. I wrote that I'd thought of him several times over the last few months, but always through the lens of money and conspiracy, and what his death had set in motion without my knowledge. And that there was something wrong with that. Thomas had been a real person I had truly loved for years, and he had died, and I'd found out from an online news blurb, because our lives had gone in different directions. There was a legitimate, quiet grief in that, one I'd buried under the urgency of everything else. I wrote that I was going to remember him as he was before he became an inheritance, like the man who knew the names of every visible star in the northern hemisphere, and who had taught me how to find Orion on clear nights in Maine, who made coffee that was far too strong and laughed at his own jokes before he could finish telling them, who had been good to me, in his own way, during our time together. I closed the pad. Ellie moved one more time before I drifted off, as if agreeing it was time to rest. The photography exhibit occupied 3 rooms of the museum, with that layout, curators love. Large, spaced-out images, each with enough room to breathe without competing with its neighbor. They were urban photos of American cities in the 70s and 80s, in black and white, filled with the kind of accidental humanity that only appears when a photographer is in the right place with enough patience to wait. James had arrived before me. He was standing in front of a large photograph, a New York City intersection with a man selling newspapers at a stand, a blurred yellow cab in the background, and a woman in a trench coat walking briskly with her eyes on the ground. He had his hands in his pockets, and the expression of someone genuinely thinking about what he was seeing, not just fulfilling the social protocol of looking interested. When he saw me arrive, he smiled. Not the wide, performative smile of someone trying to make a big impression. The small smile of someone genuinely pleased by something simple. "I'm late," I said, slightly out of breath because I'd walked faster than I should have with a 22-week bump. "You're right on time," he said, in a way that didn't sound like a line, just a fact. I was looking at this one, trying to figure out what's drawing me in. I stood beside him and looked at the photograph. The man at the newsstand had an expression that was tired, but in no way defeated. There was something in his posture. Shoulders leaning slightly forward, hands moving things with the automaticity of someone who had made that gesture 1,000 times. That was simultaneously ordinary and completely dignified. "It's his dignity," I said, without thinking much before speaking. "The way he's completely present in what he's doing, even though he's invisible to everyone around him." James was silent for a second. Then he turned his head slightly toward me. "That's exactly it," he said. We walked through the 3 rooms for nearly 2 hours. The conversation was the kind that moves naturally between what's in front of you and what's inside you, without forcing either direction. He told me about Tennessee, a small town called Clarksville, a wide river, humid summers, the kind of place where everyone knows who you are, which can be comforting or suffocating depending on the day. He told me how he'd become a vet through a path that wasn't entirely planned, starting in biology and drifting into clinical work, a decision that had felt lateral at the time, but had resulted in the only thing he'd never questioned professionally. "You love what you do," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's the most honest thing I do," he replied. "Animals don't lie about how they feel. When they're in pain, they show it. When they get better, they show that too. There's no interpretation, no agenda. It's very restful, actually. There was something in that sentence that stayed with me. In the last room, there was a bench in the center, and we sat for a few minutes looking at the opposite wall, a massive photograph of a Chicago street with kids, playing in an open fire hydrant in the summer. That specific, universal joy that spans decades and contexts and arrives intact on the other side. "Can I ask you something?" James said, looking at the photograph. "Sure." "How are you, really?" He turned slightly toward me. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But I'm asking because I noticed you've been carrying something heavy for weeks, ever since the clinic steps, and because I think people should be asked how they really are more often." I was silent for a moment. There were two possible answers. The surface answer, "I'm fine, thanks, everything's good," which I'd given to coworkers, neighbors, and acquaintances for months. And the true answer, which I'd given only to Ruth, Catherine, and the ceiling of the guest room in the early hours when I couldn't sleep. He had asked the question with a genuine openness to either one. There was no pressure in the question. There was only space. "I'm going through a difficult legal process," I said, choosing something between the two. A separation that wasn't simple. Legal matters that have taken months to get where they are now. I paused. "But I'm reaching the other side. Slowly, but I'm getting there." He nodded. He didn't ask more questions, didn't push for details, didn't offer opinions on what I'd shared. He simply said, "That's enough." And it was. It was exactly enough. December arrived with the chill that Atlanta sometimes takes seriously and sometimes ignores completely. This year, it chose to take it seriously. The mornings had that thin frost that whitens surfaces and vanishes before noon, and I'd finally accepted that I needed to buy proper winter boots because none of my shoes fit a 24-week belly that shifted my center of gravity in ways I was still learning to negotiate. The preliminary hearing was set for the 12th of the month. The week before, Catherine called me in for a prep meeting that lasted nearly 3 hours. She was methodical, as always, but there was something different in her tone. A specific concentration, the kind that appears when someone who has prepared many cases recognizes they are standing before one that is particularly well built. Derek's attorney reached out again. She said, opening the meeting. "The settlement offer has been revised. They're now offering full restitution of the transfers, plus an additional 30% in compensation, with the NDA narrowed down only to Linda's conduct." "No," I said, before she could finish presenting. "Ava, Catherine, they still want silence. The form has changed, but the goal is the same." I looked at her directly. The more they offer, the more clearly they understand how much they have to lose. I want to move forward. She looked at me for a second. Then she smiled slightly. That rare smile that appeared when she was pleased with something, but had trained herself not to show it too much. "Then let's prepare for the hearing," she said. We spent the next few hours going through the entire dossier. Catherine prepped me for questions, for the rhythm of a preliminary hearing, for what to expect from Derek's lawyer, and what not to. Raphael was there taking notes, occasionally, inserting technical details with the precision of someone who had spent hours in clerks' offices and registry files tracking information. At the end of the meeting, once the others had left the room, Catherine stayed and looked at me differently. "You've been very different from what I expected when you first walked in here," she said. "What did you expect me to be?" "More fragmented." A pause. "People who arrive in the state you were in usually take longer to pull themselves together. You organized yourself quickly." I thought for a moment about what she'd said. "I think it was her," I said, placing a hand on my stomach. "Having someone who depends on you before they even exist outside of you, it doesn't leave much room to completely fall apart." Catherine nodded slowly. "Take that with you to the hearing." The morning of December 12th dawned with clear skies and a dry, biting cold. Had slept surprisingly well. So well that I stayed in bed for a moment after waking up, just checking to see if it was real. Ruth was already up when I stepped out of my room. Coffee was brewed and toast was on the table. She was wearing the frayed blue bathrobe she only brought out for days, she considered momentous. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready," I said. And I meant it. We met Catherine at the courthouse entrance at 8:30. She was with Raphael, and an assistant I'd only seen once before. A woman named Dara, who handled the Together, and there was something about that group. 4 women and 1 man walking with briefcases and purpose into a cold marble building. That made me feel, for a moment, a surge of gratitude I hadn't yet been able to put into words. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. The judge's bench in the center, 2 parallel counsel tables, and rows of gallery benches in the back that were half-filled. I saw Derek the moment I walked in. He was sitting next to his attorney, a man in a dark suit with a professional veneer whom I'd only seen in photos until then. Derek looked like someone who had slept poorly and had dressed with extreme care to compensate. He was wearing the gray suit I recognized, the same one from the wedding photo still hanging in our old living room. My old living room, I corrected myself mentally. He looked at me when I entered. I looked back. I didn't look away. Then I sat next to Catherine and opened the legal pad I'd brought, not because I needed to take notes, but because I wanted my hands to have something to do. Linda wasn't there. Derek's lawyer had previously informed us that she wouldn't be called for this preliminary hearing, a glaringly obvious strategic move that Catherine had already anticipated. Judge Harmon entered at exactly 9 o'clock. He was a man in his 60s with reading glasses hanging around his neck and an expression that blended efficiency with genuine attentiveness, the kind of presence that is both reassuring and a warning that no time wasting would be tolerated. The preliminary hearing wasn't the final trial. Catherine had explained this several times with patience, so that I wouldn't go in with the wrong expectations. This was a hearing to present evidence, evaluate merit, and, depending on what surfaced, determine potential provisional measures, including the return of the transfers while the main case proceeded. Derek's lawyer spoke first. He presented the narrative I had expected. Derek as a man who had reacted to an emotionally difficult situation, who acknowledged errors in judgment regarding how he managed the separation, and who was willing to correct financial issues in good faith. At no point did he use the words planning, coordination, or inheritance. Catherine stood up when it was her turn, and she had that specific quality I had come to recognize over the months, the quality of someone who doesn't need volume to be heard. She presented the dossier in chronological order. The search history, the phone records, the emails from the burner account, the joint account shared by Derek and Linda, the emails sent to Gerald Moss's office using my name without authorization. As each document was introduced and entered into the official record, I watched Derek's lawyer's face. There was a subtle but undeniable shift throughout the presentation, not of surprise because he surely knew some of the material, but of recalibration. It was the kind of recalibration that happens when a professional realizes the case described to him by his client doesn't quite match the one being documented in front of a judge. Judge Harmon asked direct, sparse questions. Not frequent, but surgical. When Catherine presented the emails sent to Gerald Moss's office using my name, he asked for the document to be enlarged on the courtroom screen, and sat reading it for much longer than he had spent on the others. "Counsel," he said, looking at Derek's lawyer, "is your client aware of these emails?" Derek's lawyer exchanged a quick, whispered word with Derek before answering. "My client has no personal knowledge of the emails mentioned, Your Honor." "No personal knowledge," the judge repeated, with an intonation that wasn't exactly sarcastic, but made it clear the weight of that word choice had been noted. During the questioning phase, Derek's lawyer tried the only strategy he had left, questioning the chain of custody for the IP logs and the interpretation of the phone records. Catherine had prepared me for exactly this, and Raphael was, ready with the technical documentation establishing every point in the chain. The attempt lasted maybe 15 minutes before it visibly started to lose steam. Then something happened that wasn't in the hearing script. Derek's lawyer requested a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, Derek's lawyer huddled with him in a conversation I couldn't hear, but could observe from across the room. The lawyer spoke. Derek listened with his eyes downcast. At one point, Derek said something, and the lawyer responded with that specific look attorneys give when they're telling a client that their position isn't what the client imagined it was. When the hearing resumed, Derek's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, after consulting with my client, we are prepared to offer a formal acknowledgement of the transfers made and agreement to a full restitution of the funds, including interest, without additional conditions. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. No confidentiality agreement, no strings attached, full restitution. Catherine leaned slightly toward me and whispered, with a calmness that seemed almost comical given the magnitude of the moment. They blinked. Judge Harmon looked at both sides of the room. Counsel for the petitioner, he said, looking at Catherine. We accept the full restitution, Your Honor, she said, but we request that the full record of evidence presented today be maintained as part of the case file, as there are adjacent matters still under evaluation. The judge made a note. Granted. He took off his glasses and set them on the bench. A gesture I'd learned throughout the morning meant he was about to say something he wanted heard carefully. I wanted on the record that the body of evidence presented in this hearing raises questions that go beyond bank transfers. This court finds there are sufficient elements for further investigation into the conduct documented here. This matter will be referred to the district attorney's office for independent review. Derek didn't move when the judge said that. He remained completely still, eyes fixed on a middle distance, and I couldn't read what was on his face. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the beginning of the realization that the consequences of what had been built over months wouldn't be limited to a civil hearing. We left the courthouse at 11:42 in the morning. The December sun hit the marble steps with that winter light that is low and slanted and somehow more beautiful than the summer sun. Ruth was waiting outside. She had stayed out because the courtroom had limited capacity and had decided her energy was better spent waiting for me than witnessing something she couldn't influence. When she saw me coming down the steps, she read my face before I could say a word. We did it, she said. It wasn't a question. We did it, I confirmed. She hugged me right there on the courthouse steps, in the full glare of the December sun, and this time I didn't cry the ugly, loud way I had in that public square months ago. I just stood still inside the hug for a long moment, letting the result become real inside me instead of trying to process it immediately. Catherine appeared at my side a few minutes later, while Ruth was already calling someone to tell them, her mom, probably, or her sister, because Ruth was the type of person who celebrated other people's victories with more enthusiasm than her own. This was just the preliminary hearing, Catherine said, with that realism I had come to appreciate. The main lawsuit continues, and the DA's investigation is independent. We might not have control over its pace. I know. But it was a good day. It was a good day, I agreed. 3 days after the hearing, Gerald Moss called me from Portland. I expected it to be a call about paperwork, about travel dates to Oregon, about the bureaucratic details that still needed to be resolved to formalize the inheritance. I had delayed that part of the process as long as I could, not out of fear of the money itself, but because there was something about going to Portland that felt like a closure I wasn't quite ready for. But Gerald didn't call about bureaucracy. Ms. Harper, he said with that specific care in his voice, when we were organizing the documents for Thomas's estate, we found personal correspondence intended for specific individuals. One of those is addressed to you. Thomas wrote it a few months before he passed. A pause. With your permission, I'd like to scan it and send it via email. Or, if you prefer, you can pick it up in person when you come to Portland. I went silent. A letter. Thomas had written a letter to me. You can email it, I said. My voice was steady. but there was something beneath it that wasn't. "I'll send it today." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand for a time I couldn't measure. Ruth had gone to work. The apartment was quiet with that weekday morning silence that has its own texture. The fridge humming, a bird outside, the distant sound of a car. The email arrived 40 minutes later. I opened it. There was an attachment, a scan of a handwritten note. Thomas's handwriting was just as I remembered, slanting to the right, hurried, the hand of someone whose thoughts always arrived faster than his fingers could keep up. I read slowly. "Megan, if you're reading this, then Gerald did what I asked, which means something I planned for a long time has finally been executed now that I'm no longer here to see it. I don't know how you are. I don't know what your life looks like right now. It's been years since we truly spoke, and during that time I did what I thought was right. I let you live your life without the shadow of my presence interfering. But there are things that need to be said, even if they arrive late. You were the most honest person I ever had in my life. I'm not saying that to be poetic. I'm saying it because it's a fact I came to understand over the years, after we split up. You never wanted anything from me other than what I was capable of offering as a person. When I'd get stuck in my work and forget the world existed, you didn't pretend everything was fine. You told me, with that calm and steadiness that was so yours, that there was a distance growing between us. I didn't listen. And when you realized I wasn't going to change, you left without drama and without cruelty. That takes a kind of class most people don't have. When I was drafting my will, I thought for a long time about who I wanted to leave what I'd built to. I have no children. The family I do have is complicated in the way most families are. True love tangled with self-interest and old wounds that never quite healed. And then I thought of you. You never knew about the money. When we were together, I was just starting out. I had the drive and the ambition, but the results were still in the future. You loved me before the results. That, Megan, is a rare thing in the world I lived in these last few years. I'm not leaving this to you as payment for having loved me. It doesn't work that way, and you know it doesn't work that way. I'm leaving it to you because I trust you'll know what to do with it. Because you always knew what to do with the things that came into your hands, be it an architectural project, a life, or the end of a marriage. You have discernment, and discernment, I've learned over time, is the rarest and most valuable thing a person can have. Take care of yourself. With genuine affection, Thomas. When I finished reading, I sat in silence for a long time. The light in the kitchen had shifted while I read. The sun had moved and was now streaming through the side window at a low, late-morning angle, that December light that is both golden and melancholy. There was something perfect about it, something unintentionally right, that made me think that sometimes the world has more poetic sense than it should. I cried. Not for the money, not for the lawsuit or for what still lay ahead. I cried for Thomas, who had thought of me when he was preparing to die, and had written those words in a slanted, hurried hand, because his thoughts arrived faster than his fingers. I cried for the version of me that had loved that man, in a small apartment in Portland with muggy summers and coffee that was way too strong. I cried for the distance between who I had been then and who I was becoming now, and for the beautiful strangeness of how those two versions were connected by a thread I hadn't seen until that moment. Then I wiped my face with the napkin on the table. I folded it carefully, as if the act of carefully folding something small was a way of honoring something larger. I picked up my phone and texted James. "Friday, that restaurant with the chalkboard menu, if the invitation still stands." He replied in 3 minutes. It always did. I put the phone on the table. I put my hand on my stomach. "Ellie," I said in a low voice to the quiet kitchen and the golden December light, "we're going to be okay." And for the first time in all these months, when I said it It wasn't a promise I had to force myself to believe. It was simply the truth. January New Year's Day arrived with that particular quality only the start of a year possesses, not necessarily lighter than what came before, but with a different edge, as if the calendar turning a page actually created a small crack of fresh air in the world. I knew it was partly an illusion, that problems didn't respect dates, and that the legal process would continue at its own pace, regardless of how many fireworks had streaked across the sky at midnight. But there was something about waking up on the 1st of January, 27 weeks pregnant, in Ruth's guest room bed, which had become as familiar as my own body, and feeling Ellie move with that growing vigor she'd developed in recent weeks. There was something in that which made the illusion valuable enough to be received with gratitude. Ruth had made pancakes. It was her New Year's tradition, something from her childhood that she'd carried into adulthood with that affectionate stubbornness people have for the rituals that anchor them. We both sat at the table with pancakes, maple syrup, and coffee. Orange juice for me, as I had swapped coffee for tea in recent weeks on my doctor's advice. And we didn't talk about anything important for a long time. We just existed beside each other in a quiet morning, which was, I had learned, one of the most sophisticated forms of care two people could offer one another. "This year is going to be different," Ruth said at some point, looking out the window at the still silent street. "Anything is different from last year," I said. She looked at me with that smile of hers, which meant she agreed but thought I was being modest about the magnitude of what was to come. She wasn't wrong. The first months of the year moved with a speed I hadn't expected after months where every week had felt elastic and endless. Maybe that's how time works. When you're in the middle of survival, it drags. When you begin to emerge on the other side, it accelerates to compensate. The legal case advanced on two simultaneous fronts that Catherine managed with the methodical efficiency I had come to trust completely. On the civil side, after the December hearing and Derek's formal acknowledgement of the transfers, there was a period of additional documentation and negotiation regarding the amounts with interest and legal fees. Catherine had been clear from the start that any final settlement had to be full and without non-disclosure agreements, and she held that line with a firmness Derek's lawyer had tested more than once before accepting there was no wiggle room. The full restitution arrived in February. Not just the amounts transferred on the night I was kicked out, but all the movement identified over the previous months that Dara's team had tracked with an archaeologist's patience that was impressive to witness. The final sum was larger than I had initially calculated, because there were more layers than what appeared on the surface. Catherine called me when the transfer was confirmed. "It's in your account," she said. I opened the banking app. I saw the number. I closed the app. I opened it again just to be sure. "Catherine," I said, "thank you for everything, from the beginning." "It was your case," she said, with that blunt honesty I had learned to love in her. "I just organized what you brought me." On the front, the district attorney's office had initiated independently. The process moved at a pace that was out of my control, and that Catherine had advised me not to try to control. What I knew was what the public records gradually revealed. That Derek had been formally served, that Linda had hired her own lawyer, and that there was an ongoing investigation into both of their conduct that might or might not result in formal charges depending on what the prosecution concluded. I didn't follow it closely. It had reached a point where whatever happened to them was in the right hands, and I needed to stop spending my energy in that direction. Not out of kindness and not out of indifference, but by a deliberate choice of where I wanted to spend what I had. And what I had, I gradually realized, was growing. With Thomas's estate, the bureaucratic matters were settled through February and March during a trip to Portland that lasted 4 days. I had put it off as long as I could, but at 30 weeks pregnant, and with the doctor starting to talk about safe travel windows, I had to go before the window closed. Ruth wanted to go. Of course she did. Portland in March has that quality of a city waking up from a long winter, still cold, with frequent rain, but with the first signs of green returning with that vegetal stubbornness that doesn't ask for permission. We stayed in a small, boutique hotel near downtown, and during the 2 days of meetings at Gerald Moss's office. I sat across the table from a man who had held Thomas's words for months, waiting for them to reach me, and I signed the documents necessary for what Thomas had wanted to finally happen. Gerald Moss was younger than his voice on the phone had suggested. Mid-40s, glasses, that specific patience of someone who works with documents and the weight of life's endings. When we finished the formalities on the last day, he handed me an envelope. "Thomas left this too," he said. "It's not correspondence anymore. It's photographs." I opened the envelope. There were 5 printed photographs. Not digital, printed on photo paper like they used to be. 3 were landscapes of Oregon that I didn't recognize. 1 was of the apartment we had shared in Portland, taken from an angle I didn't remember, with the light from that time coming through, the window that overlooked the park. And the last one was of the 2 of us at some mutual friend's party. I was laughing at something I no longer recalled, and he was looking at me with that expression of someone who is genuinely happy to be where they are. I stared at that photograph for a long time. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was something more complicated and gentler than sadness. It was gratitude for the reality of that captured moment, for the proof that it had been real, that good. People had genuinely loved each other, and then followed different paths, without that making the love any less true. I put the photographs back in the envelope with care. "Thank you," I said to Gerald. On our last day in Portland, Ruth and I walked down to the riverfront in the late afternoon. The sky was that soft gray Oregon has, not threatening, just calm and steady. We watched the water for a while without saying much. "Are you okay?" Ruth asked in her way, knowing the question opened space for any answer. "I am," I said. And then, because it was true, and she deserved the full version, "I'm thinking about what kind of person I want to be from now on, not what I want to do or have, the kind of person." Ruth was silent for a moment, considering that. "I think you already know," she said. "I think you've known since that night in the car in the rain. You just didn't have the space yet to act on it." I thought about that the whole way back to the hotel. James Callahan entered my life the way good things tend to when you've stopped forcing them. Slowly, naturally, without announcement. Friday nights at the restaurant with the chalkboard menu became a habit throughout January and February. Sometimes Ruth came along, which turned dinner into a lively trio, where he and she discovered they shared an incomprehensible tolerance for Western movies and an equally inexplicable aversion to green bell peppers. Sometimes it was just the 2 of us, and the conversation had a different quality during those dinners. Not necessarily more intimate, but quieter, with that rhythm that happens when 2 people are comfortable enough to let silences exist without needing to fill them. I told him about the legal case gradually, over several conversations. Never all, at once, because there was no once that could hold it all. He listened the way I had noticed from the beginning, completely present, without interrupting with unsolicited opinions, without doing that thing many people do of turning someone else's story into a springboard to tell their own. When I told him about Thomas's letter in February, on a night we stayed longer than usual at the table after the plates were cleared, he was silent for a long time after I finished. "He knew you well," he said finally. "He did," I agreed. "In the way that people who truly loved you continue to know you even after your paths diverge." James looked at the table for a moment. "My ex-wife would say I work too much," he said, in a way that wasn't a non sequitur. It was reciprocal honesty. And she'd be right. I still have that problem. I stay at work late not because the job demands it, but because there's a part of me that feels more competent inside a veterinary clinic than in any other situation in life. A pause. "I'm working on it." I looked at him. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. It felt fair, given what you shared. There was something in that simple exchange that was, in miniature, exactly what I had gone years without. Not perfection, not the absence of flaws or history, or without using honesty as a performance. In March, when I returned from Portland, James was waiting for me at the restaurant the following Friday, with a small plant on the table. The same species Ruth had put in my room months before. "Plants help you breathe," he said when I sat down, with a slightly performative seriousness that indicated he had researched the right thing to bring and was satisfied with the result. I looked at the plant. I looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" "From a very reliable source. Ruth. Of course it was Ruth." He held my hand over the table that night, just for a few minutes, and he said nothing, and I said nothing, and the low light of the restaurant did the rest. It wasn't a moment of declaration or a formal decision. It was simply two adults with history and complexity and parts under construction, recognizing they wanted to keep going in the same direction, at least for now, at least to see. It was enough. It was more than enough. Ellie was born on a Sunday in April. It wasn't dramatic in a cinematic sense. There was no storm, no desperate race to the hospital. None of the elements stories usually use to mark births as extraordinary events. It was an April Sunday with moderate sun and a breeze that moved the curtains in the hospital hallway in a way I watched for a long time while we walked, me, Ruth, and Nurse Paula, who had infinite patience and a voice that involuntarily calmed you through the halls during the hours of labor. James was in the waiting room. He had asked weeks before, in a direct and pressure-free way, "Do you want me to be there?" And I had thought for a whole day before answering yes. Not because I needed anyone else inside the delivery room besides Ruth, but because there was something right about him being on the outside, present, waiting. The way some people show they care not by taking up space, but by simply being available within it. Ruth was with me when Ellie arrived. She held my hand during the hardest part, with a grip that probably left marks, and when Ellie's cry filled the air for the first time, that inaugural, indignant, and perfect cry, the cry of someone who just discovered the world exists and has an immediate opinion about it. Ruth cried, with that total intensity that was completely hers, without any attempt to hide it. Nurse Paula placed Ellie in my arms, and the world stopped. Not metaphorically. Literally, the world that existed outside that moment ceased to be relevant for a period of time I can't measure. There was only her, tiny and red and perfect, with her eyes closed and her fists clenched near her face, like someone still deciding if she approved of that abrupt transition. And there was me, holding her with hands that shook slightly, looking at every inch of that face as if I were memorizing something I knew I'd never forget but couldn't afford not to record with care. "Hi, Ellie," I said. She opened one eye, just one, for a second, before closing it again, like someone assessing the situation and deciding she could wait a bit longer for conclusions. I laughed, a laugh that mixed exhaustion and relief and joy in a sound I hadn't made before and didn't know I was capable of. Ruth was beside me with her eyes completely soaked and a smile that took up her whole face. "She's perfect," Ruth whispered. "She is," I agreed. James came in half an hour later, once I was settled, and Ellie had been examined and cleared by the medical team with all the metrics they needed to approve. He entered with that naturalness that was characteristic of him. No fanfare, no excess energy that people sometimes bring to emotionally charged situations when they don't quite know how to behave. He stood near the door for a second, looking at me and Ellie. "Can I come closer?" he asked. "You can," I said. He came over. He looked at Ellie in my arms with due expression I had seen in him a few times, one of complete attention, of total presence in what is in front of him, without a filter of performance over it. "She looks serious," he said softly. "She looks like she's evaluating the room," I agreed. "Smart girl." Ruth, on the other side of the bed, made a sound that was simultaneously agreement and satisfaction with the scene she was witnessing. I looked at her, and she quickly pretended to be very interested in the window. James stayed for an hour, left to let me rest, and returned in the evening with food from the restaurant with the chalkboard menu, packed in containers he had negotiated with the cook, who already knew us by name. I ate in the hospital bed with Ellie sleeping in the bassinet nearby, and there was something in that simple improvised scene, favorite restaurant food in a hospital room with yellow light and a newborn sleeping 3 feet away. That had more of the life I wanted than anything I had ever consciously planned for myself. The months that followed were months of building. Not the grand, dramatic construction of a comeback story, but the quiet, concrete building of a life being deliberately chosen. I found an apartment in May, the first place that was entirely mine. It was in a 3-story building with a large living room window that caught the afternoon sun and a small balcony just big enough for 2 planters and a chair. I painted Ellie's room a soft sage green, the color the pediatrician said was a good choice for a newborn's visual development. I spent an entire Saturday assembling her crib with instructions that seemed to make more sense in Swedish than in English, while Ruth sat on the floor beside me, commenting on the merits of Scandinavian design as I repeatedly fitted pieces in the wrong order. Work returned to full speed in June, when Ellie was 2 months old, and I had found a nanny named Diane. She had that specific serenity of someone who had spent decades with babies and knew the exact difference between a hunger cry, a tired cry, and an existential one. I went back to the office with that mix of relief at having an identity beyond motherhood, and the guilt for feeling that relief, a feeling every working mother knows, and which takes time to reconcile with the idea that both can coexist without one compromising the other. Stalled projects came back to life. New ones arrived. There was one in particular, a community space renovation in a neighborhood in South Atlanta, a social impact project funded by a foundation, that I had proposed during the chaos of the previous months, in a moment of clarity about the kind of work I wanted to do. It had been approved in March while I was still in Portland. I began working on it with a focus that was different from the attention I had given previous projects. It was the kind of focus that comes when your work aligns with who you are becoming. With Thomas's inheritance, I made decisions he would have recognized as mine. No extravagance, no radical lifestyle overhauls, none of the anxiety of someone who suddenly has more than they know how to handle. I invested with careful guidance. I set up a trust for Ellie. I made a substantial donation to a nonprofit supporting victims of domestic violence that I had found during months of research. I did this not because my situation had been domestic violence in the strictest sense, but because I recognized in their work something I had lacked, resources and a voice at a time when having resources and a voice is literally what determines which paths are possible. And I bought an apartment. The one with the balcony and the window that caught the late sun. I paid in cash because I could, and because there was something about owning a place that was entirely and unequivocally mine that closed a circle that had been opened that rainy night in front of a closed door. In August, Derek was formally charged by the district attorney with fraud and conduct related to the illegal diversion of marital assets. Linda was included in the indictment based on evidence from the email accounts and financial records. The criminal process moved at its own pace, independent of me, and I had reached a point where I could receive news about it with a distance that wasn't indifference. It was the result of having poured my energy in the right directions long enough that their story was no longer the center of gravity in my life. Catherine called me when the charges were formalized. "Did you see?" she asked. "I did. How are you?" I thought for a genuine moment before answering. "Relieved," I said. Not angry, not the kind of satisfaction that hurts. Just relieved. Like when you solve a problem that's been sitting for too long, and you can finally stop carrying the weight of not fixing it. "That's healthy," Catherine said. "Were you expecting something else?" "I never expect anything," she said. "But I'm glad when it happens." Linda sent me a letter in September. Handwritten, 3 pages long, delivered by mail. I read it carefully, from the first to the last line, and then sat with the paper in my hand for a while. It wasn't a letter asking for forgiveness or to forget. It was a letter that described, with a clear-eyed honesty that obviously cost her something, how she had ended up where she was. Derek's debts she had hidden from me for years. The fear of losing her son to circumstances she couldn't control. The progressive rationalization that makes wrong decisions feel justified when you build them slowly enough that you don't see what you're actually constructing. There was one line in the middle of the letter that stayed with me. It never occurred to me to ask what you needed. I only saw what Derek needed, and then what I needed to keep him okay. You were there, but I never truly saw you. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope. I kept it in a drawer, not because I intended to reread it often, but because throwing it away felt more definitive than I was ready to be. I didn't reply. Not yet. There were some things that needed more time than others, and I had learned to recognize the difference between the time that is procrastination and the time that is a process. Ellie was 6 months old when James asked me if I wanted to take a step forward. It wasn't a dramatic question. It was James. Direct, honest, no performance. We were on my balcony on a Sunday in October. She was lying on her playmat inside, the two of us with coffee outside and the door open so I could hear her. The afternoon sun was coming through the large window as it always did, turning everything golden. "I don't know how this is supposed to look," he said, looking at his coffee. "Because I've never done this before with a situation like this, with someone who has a small child, with all the complexity you carry." He paused. "But I know that when I'm here, I feel like I'm in the right place, and I know I want to keep going." I just looked at him. There were every reason for caution. The complexity was real, the history was real, the under-construction parts, his and mine, were real. Ellie was real and tiny, and my absolute priority, and anything I brought into her life had to be brought with care and intention. But there was also the fact that James had appeared on a dangerous ledge on a difficult day and had held my arm without making a big deal out of it. There was the fact that he had been present over the months, being exactly who he said he was, without wavering, without an agenda I could identify, without the feeling that there was something underneath I hadn't seen yet. There was the fact that Ellie, when he was around, had that look of serious evaluation she'd had since day one, which I'd learned to recognize as her processing face, and then she would invariably resolve the situation by grabbing the finger of whoever was within reach, with the determination of someone who had made a decision. "I want to keep going too," I said. He looked at me. With that way of his that was all attention, all presence. "There's a lot I still don't know about how to do this," he said, honest as always. "Me too," I said. "But I think we know enough to keep figuring it out." Ellie chose that moment to let out a loud, opinionated sound from inside the apartment. Not a cry, just the kind of vocalization she'd developed in recent weeks to indicate she had something to contribute to any ongoing situation. James smiled. "She agrees," he said. "She always has an opinion," I confirmed. There is a photograph that Ruth took in November, on a Sunday afternoon, without me knowing she was taking it. I'm sitting in the chair on the balcony with Ellie on my lap. She was 7 months old then, already with that sturdy baby feel, starting to want to sit upright and observe the world with growing authority. James is beside me, leaning slightly toward me, saying something I don't remember, but it was clearly making me laugh. The plants on the balcony are in the background, green and steady. The afternoon sun is doing what it always does in that window. Ruth sent me the photo without a comment, just the image. I looked at it for a long time. Not because it was an extraordinary photograph. Technically, it was simple, casual framing, natural light. But there was something in it that was hard to name precisely, the specific quality of a moment that wasn't being staged to be remembered, that was simply happening. And because of that, It had that texture of a real thing that the best photographs have. I thought about the photograph Gerald Moss had given me in Portland. Me and Thomas at a party, him looking at me with genuine contentment. 2 photographs of real moments, separated by years and a quantity of life that barely fit in memory, and both true in the way true things are true, without effort, without construction, simply present. I saved Ruth's photo in the folder where I kept Thomas's. Today, Ellie is almost a year old. She's on the rug in the living room now, trying with absolute determination to pull herself up using the coffee table, falling, and trying again with that persistence that she didn't learn from anyone because it just came that way, built into her. Part of who she is since before she had words to be anything. I look at her and think, sometimes, how strange the path was that brought us to this room, this light, this afternoon. I think about that night in October last year, the gift box with the blue and white bow, the rain starting exactly when the door closed, the suitcases on the wet sidewalk, the cold car and the shimmering asphalt and the 100 and how, $17 in the bank. I think about how convinced I was that I was living the worst moment of my life, and how right I was. It was the worst moment. And how I was completely wrong at the same time, because the worst moment was also the beginning of everything that mattered. I'm not saying I'm grateful for what Derek did. I'm not made of that kind of generosity yet, and I'm not sure I ever should be. What he and Linda did was calculated and cruel, and the consequences they are facing are deserved consequences, not tragedies for anyone to mourn. Justice isn't revenge, but it is necessary, and I believe in that. What I'm saying is different. I'm saying the rain that night washed away things that needed to go. It washed away a marriage that had been built on a version of me that I was, in a way, shrinking myself to fit into, without quite realizing I was shrinking. It washed away 6 years of trust placed in a spot that didn't deserve it. It washed away the comfortable and slightly suffocating illusion of a life that seemed stable, only because I had stopped questioning what was beneath the surface. And in exchange, it left space. Space for Ellie, who is the realest thing, the most mine thing, that has ever existed. Space for the work I chose with intention, instead of just drifting into. Space for a friendship with Ruth that was always deep, but became even more honest when she saw me at rock bottom and stayed by my side without blinking. Space for James, with his vet jacket and his reread books and his honesty about the under-construction parts that still need work. Space to understand that Thomas had seen me in a way I hadn't seen myself, and that there was something valuable in receiving that gift, even if it arrived late, and in a way I never would have chosen. Space for myself. For the I version of me that doesn't shrink. Ellie finally manages to pull herself all the way up at the coffee table and stands for a second. Precarious, radiant, absolutely certain that this is an extraordinary feat, which it is, which it always will be, before plopping back down on the rug with a thud that doesn't bother her one bit. She looks at me. I look at her. She smiles that smile of hers, which still has no teeth but has a luminosity that doesn't need them, and I think, this is it. This is exactly it. Not the fortune, which is real, and which I handle responsibly. Not the victory in court, which was necessary and just. Not the romance with James, which is true and growing the way true things grow, slowly, rooted, in no rush to get anywhere because it's already in the right place. It's this moment. This rug, this light, this toothless smile, this life I didn't plan, and that is completely mine. The rain that night in October washed away a lot. I've never been so grateful for a storm.